On the morning of October 15, 1943, at 6:27 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel William Shomo sat low in his P-39 Airacobra cockpit, 300 feet above the dark waters of Rabaul Harbor, watching through his gun sight as a convoy of Japanese supply barges moved below. Those barges had been carrying vital supplies to enemy troops for months without any American pilot managing to stop them. At 31 years old, Shomo was the commanding officer of the 7th Fighter Squadron, yet had no confirmed barge kills. He was flying a plane that every pilot in the Pacific called useless, the Bell P-39. The Airacobra was the aircraft nobody wanted. It was too slow for dogfights, couldn't climb past 20,000 feet without choking like an old truck, and handled like a brick with wings. When Shomo's squadron first received their Airacobras at Henderson Field 6 months earlier, his pilots had groaned loudly. Major General Fuchi dismissed it as a ground-pounder's toy, warning Shomo to keep his flying coffins away from real combat. Other squadron leaders joked that the P-39's biggest danger was to its own pilot. Even the mechanics called it the flying disaster, with its engine mounted behind the cockpit and a 37mm cannon sticking out of the nose like a failed science experiment. The cannon itself weighed 400 pounds and fired shells made to destroy tanks, not planes, shells so heavy they slowed the aircraft even more. Every pilot in the Pacific knew the rules of air combat. Speed kills, altitude wins, and maneuverability keeps you alive. The Airacobra had none of those. But as Shomo lined up his approach on the lead barge, watching Japanese soldiers rushing across the deck with ammunition and medical crates, he was about to learn that sometimes the most hated weapon can become the most feared one. The Japanese had no idea what that nose cannon could do to a wooden supply boat at close range. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had arrived at Henderson Field in March 1943 like an unwanted stepchild at a family reunion. Lieutenant Colonel Shomo watched as his pilots circled the plane with the same excitement as morticians inspecting a difficult corpse. It sat awkwardly on the coral runway with its tricycle landing gear, an odd feature that made veteran pilots uneasy, and that massive 37mm cannon protruding from the spinner like a metallic accusation. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the squadron's chief mechanic, ran his hand along the fuselage and shook his head. "Sir, this thing's got its engine behind the pilot and a cannon where the engine should be. It's like somebody built it backward." The aircraft specifications didn't help. The Allison V1710 engine produced 1,150 horsepower, decent on paper, but mounted behind the cockpit, it created a balance problem that made the plane handle like a weighted seesaw. Its top speed was 377 miles per hour at sea level, dropping to just 290 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, where most air battles in the Pacific took place. The service ceiling was listed at 20,000 feet, but pilots found that climbing past 15,000 turned the Airacobra into what Captain John Wrigley called a flying anvil with delusions of grandeur. The range of 500 miles was fine for local missions, but in the vast Pacific, where flights stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean, pilots joked that the fuel gauge moved faster than the airspeed indicator. Major General Enzo Fuchi made his feelings clear during his first inspection of the squadron. He walked around Shomo's plane with his hands behind his back, pausing to glare at the cannon. "Colonel, this is what happens when designers try to reinvent the wheel," he said. "We need fighters that can climb fast and fight high, not flying artillery." He kicked the nose gear strut with his boot. "The Japanese Zero can outclimb this thing by 3,000 feet per minute and outrun it, above 15,000 feet. What exactly are we supposed to do with it?" Shomo had been asking himself the same question for weeks. The 7th Fighter Squadron had switched from P-40 Warhawks, which couldn't beat Japanese fighters but at least felt like real combat planes. The Airacobra felt like a compromise no one wanted. Its 37mm M4 cannon had been built for destroying tanks in Europe, firing explosive shells at 2,800 feet per second. Each shell weighed 1.5 pounds, heavier than a dozen machine gun bullets combined, and the cannon only carried 30 rounds. In dogfights, where ammunition vanished in seconds, that felt like bringing a single-shot rifle to a machine gun battle. Lieutenant Edward C.S. summed up the squadron's frustration during an April meeting. "Sir, we trained on this thing for 6 weeks at Hamilton Field, and I still don't know what it's for. The cannon's great for punching holes in buildings, but hitting a moving zero with it? You'll fire all 30 rounds and hit nothing but sky. The .50 calibers are standard, nothing special, and good luck even getting close when every Japanese fighter can outclimb and outrun you, the Airacobra's." Unusual design caused problems beyond its performance numbers. The engine's placement put the propeller shaft directly under the pilot's seat, connecting to the front propeller with a 10-foot drive shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This design allowed room for the cannon, but it also meant that if the shaft was damaged, the pilot would be left powerless with a spinning propeller. The tricycle landing gear was more stable on the ground than traditional tail draggers, but it was heavier and more complicated, adding weight the plane couldn't afford. Training flights soon exposed its flaws. During mock dogfights with Marine F-4U Corsairs at Henderson, the Airacobras lost every battle above 10,000 feet. The Corsairs could climb away easily, leaving the P-39 pilots to dodge and hope their opponents made mistakes. Captain Wrigley's report was blunt. Attempted intercept of simulated bomber. Formation at 18,000 feet. By the time I reached altitude, bombers had already completed their run and returned to base. Climb rate above 15,000 insufficient for combat operations. The effect on squadron morale was immediate and harsh. Pilots trained for high-altitude missions now flew planes that couldn't reach those heights. The Japanese held air superiority by fighting higher, knowing American fighters couldn't follow. Shomo watched his pilots' confidence sink with every mission. These were experienced men, veterans of P-40s and P-38s, skilled in combat tactics and survivors of Pacific battles. But the Airacobra made them feel like beginners again, struggling against a machine that resisted them at every turn. Its problems multiplied in combat. The cannon's recoil slowed the plane and threw off aim. The heavy ammo shifted the center of gravity, and the rear engine caused strange vibrations that made it hard to detect mechanical issues mid-flight. By late April, the squadron's readiness reports told the story. Out of 24 planes, only 18 were fit to fly on any given day due to drivetrain problems. Pilot performance scores dropped compared to earlier aircraft, and training success rates were the lowest in the group. The Airacobra wasn't just weak, it was dragging the whole squadron. Combat effectiveness mattered deeply at a time when every aircraft and every mission counted in maintaining American air superiority in the Pacific. The war was being fought in 3 dimensions, and the P-39 Airacobra seemed unable to reach 2 of them. The revelation didn't come from headquarters or training manuals, but from a desperate mission that no one wanted. On the morning of May 12, 1943, intelligence reported a convoy of Japanese supply barges moving down the slot between Guadalcanal and New Georgia under the cover of night. These weren't warships or fast transports. They were wooden boats, 60 to 80 feet long, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements for isolated Japanese garrisons. The barges hugged the coastlines and moved only at night, making them almost impossible for regular bombers to hit accurately. Lieutenant General George Kenney's headquarters had struggled with the barge problem for months. High-altitude bombers missed more than they hit, wasting valuable bombs on empty ocean while the barges continued their nightly runs. Dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless could destroy single targets, but were easy prey for Japanese fighters and couldn't stay over the target area long enough to wipe out entire convoys. P-25 Mitchell bombers flying skip bombing missions had some success, but they needed several planes to destroy what smaller, quicker fighters should have been able to handle. 3 days after the latest intelligence briefing, Shomo stood in General Kenny's office at Port Moresby, staring at a wall map covered in red pins marking successful Japanese supply runs. Kenny pointed at the cluster of pins around Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. "Colonel, we're losing this logistics war one barge at a time. Every night, 20 to 30 of these vessels move supplies that keep Japanese forces alive. Our bombers can't hit them consistently, and our fighters can't carry enough ordnance to matter." Turning from the map, he looked Shomo straight in the eye. "I want you to take your Airacobras down to wavetop level and see what that cannon can do against wooden hulls." The mission plan broke every rule in the fighter pilot's handbook. Instead of climbing to interception altitude, the Airacobras would fly under 500 feet, following the coastline until they spotted barge convoys. Instead of fast, high-G dogfights, they'd make slow, deliberate firing runs, using the 37mm cannon like a sniper rifle against individual boats. The plane's biggest weaknesses, poor high-altitude performance and slow climb rate, suddenly didn't matter. Its biggest flaw, the heavy nose cannon, now looked like a possible advantage. Shomo spent 2 days studying Navy intelligence reports about Japanese barge construction. The vessels were made from tropical hardwoods with steel plates protecting vital sections like the engine area and steering post. Each barge carried 15 to 30 men and often mounted at least one heavy machine gun for defense. They were tougher than expected. .50 caliber bullets could damage them but rarely sink them quickly, giving the crew time to beach the barge and save the cargo. The 37mm M4 cannon, on the other hand, fired both armor-piercing and high-explosive shells designed to punch through tank armor from over 1,000 yards away. Against wooden boats, that power would be overwhelming. A single shell could blow a hole big enough to sink a barge within minutes, while the armor-piercing rounds could rip through the reinforced sections that machine guns couldn't touch. Lieutenant C.S. volunteered for the first experimental mission, joined by Captain Wrigley and 2 other pilots. They took off from Henderson Field at 1600 hours on May 16th, heading northwest toward the Japanese-held coast of New Georgia. The flight plan instructed them to drop to wavetop height 20 miles from the target, follow the coastline southward, and maintain radio silence. If they found barges, they were to attack individually, fire once, and pull away to check results. The challenges of low-altitude flying showed up immediately. At 500 feet and 300 miles per hour, the Airacobras moved fast, but navigating by sight demanded total focus. Islands, reefs, and coastlines that looked clear on maps turned into confusing smears of green jungle and white surf. Radio navigation was limited, and the compass often failed near volcanic magnetic fields. At 1745 hours, CS spotted the first barge, a single boat about 2 miles offshore, painted dark green with brown patches that made it almost invisible until sunlight flashed off its wake. He radioed his wingman and made a wide turn to start his attack run, dropping below 200 feet above the waves. The barge crew saw him coming and opened fire with what looked like a 25mm automatic cannon midship. Tracers sliced through the air, forcing CS to weave as he approached. At 800 yards, he locked onto the target and squeezed the trigger. The first 37mm round splashed short, throwing up a white spray. The second hit dead on, just ahead of the steering area. The whole vessel erupted in a blast of smoke and debris. The shell had exploded inside the cargo hold, likely filled with ammunition or fuel. Secondary explosions tore through the barge, and within half a minute it was sinking by the stern, bow pointing skyward. Survivors jumped into the sea as the wreck disappeared below. CS circled once to confirm the kill, then regrouped with the others for the return flight to Henderson Field. That evening's debrief changed everything. One 37mm shell had done what usually took several bombing runs or long strafing passes. The cannon's heavy shells were perfect for destroying lightly armored boats, and the Airacobra's steady aim made precision hits easier than in faster, twitchier fighters. Best of all, the low-altitude flight profile used the aircraft's strengths and completely avoided its high-altitude weaknesses. Within 48 hours, General Kenny approved more barge hunting operations, giving Shomo's squadron assigned coastal patrol zones. Missions would be flown at dawn and dusk when Japanese barges were most active, with pairs of planes flying together for cover against defensive fire. For the first time since receiving their Airacobras, the 7th Fighter Squadron had found a mission that suited their aircraft perfectly, a mission that would silence all doubts. Took off at 0530 hours on October 15, 1943. Intelligence had located the largest Japanese barge convoy of the month, 12 vessels carrying ammunition and medical supplies to remote garrisons on Bougainville. The convoy was traveling in daylight, escorted by 40 fighters, confident that no American aircraft could threaten them over Empress Augusta Bay. Shomo led 8 Airacobras toward the intercept point, skimming the waves to stay below Japanese radar. Major General Fuchi had made his stance clear during the briefing 3 hours earlier. Standing before the assembled pilots at Henderson Field, he pointed to reconnaissance photos showing the convoy's defensive layout. "This," he said, "is exactly the kind of operation that proves my point about the P-39. Fuchi had warned them of the mission's limitations. 12 heavily defended targets with fighter escort. You'll be lucky to damage 2 or 3 barges before the Zeros arrive. I'm authorizing this mission against my better judgment." His words hung in the pre-dawn air like a challenge, and every pilot in the squadron felt the weight of proving that their aircraft could truly fight. The convoy appeared on the horizon at 0715, exactly where intelligence had predicted. 12 wooden barges moved in 3 tight columns, each around 70 feet long and armed with at least 1 heavy machine gun. The lead vessels carried extra weapons minus 20mm automatic cannons and multiple gun mounts. Above them, 4 Japanese Zeros cruised at 8,000 feet, confident that any American attack would have to climb straight into their path. Shomo's tactical plan took advantage of the Airacobra's one true strength, the ability to attack from sea level while the enemy fighters stayed high. The Airacobras would come in from the south, flying low against the dark water until the last possible second. Each pilot had a specific target. They would make 1 firing pass with a 37mm cannon, then drop back down to wave-top level before the Zeros could dive. Speed and surprise had to replace altitude and agility. At 5 miles out, Shomo gave the attack order over the radio. The 8 Airacobras spread into a line formation, each one fixed on a different target. The Japanese barges continued on course, unaware of the danger until Lieutenant CS opened fire at 1,200 yards. His first 37mm shell struck the lead barge just forward of the bow gun and detonated it in a massive explosion, sending fragments spinning hundreds of feet into the air. In seconds, every barge that could return fire did. Machine guns and cannons filled the air with a storm of tracers and bursts. Captain Wrigley banked left as 20mm rounds sliced past his canopy, then steadied for his run. At 800 yards, he fired, and 2 shells tore through his target's hull below the waterline. The barge immediately began to list as its crew scrambled to escape the flooding hold. Above the chaos, the 4 Zeros rolled into steep dives toward the attackers. But by then, the Airacobras had already finished their passes and were racing away just above the waves. Their cannon fire had been devastating. 6 barges were sinking or dead in the water. The massive 37mm shells, built to destroy tanks, were just as deadly against wooden ships full of fuel and ammunition. The Japanese Zero pilots faced an impossible situation. Their targets were flying so low that the Zeros couldn't maintain proper speed at that altitude. Any attempt to dive on the Americans meant flying straight through their own side's gunfire. Lieutenant Yamamoto, leading the Japanese patrol, tried to intercept Shomo's aircraft as it climbed. But Shomo simply nosed down toward the sea and sped away. The Zero could outclimb and outrun the Airacobra at high altitude, but down near the surface, that advantage disappeared. Shomo turned for another run, this time aiming at one of the larger escort vessels armed with twin 20mm cannons and carrying what looked like a full company of soldiers. The defensive fire was intense. Tracers weaved a glowing web around his plane, but the Airacobra's steady handling let him hold his aim. At 600 yards, he fired 3 rounds in quick bursts. The first splashed short, the second hit the engine compartment, freezing the vessel in place, and the third slammed into the cargo hold, detonating the ammunition stacked inside. The blast was enormous, sending a black column of smoke high into the sky. The barge vanished in seconds, consumed by flames and explosions that kept erupting for minutes as ammunition cooked off, throwing streams of tracers in all directions like deadly fireworks. The shock to the remaining barges was immediate. 2 broke formation and fled toward the coast, abandoning the convoy rather than face another attack. By 0800, the battle was over. Of the 12 Japanese barges that had started the journey, 9 were sinking or already gone. The 3 survivors limped north toward a small island, but their slow pace made them easy prey for follow-up attacks. The 4 Zeros managed to damage 1 Airacobra. Lieutenant Peterson's plane took cannon hits in the wing root, affecting his aileron control, yet all 8 American aircraft made it back. The mission's results were undeniable. 8 P39 Airacobras had destroyed or crippled 75% of a major enemy supply convoy in less than 30 minutes. The plane once mocked as too slow for dogfights had proven deadly as a precision strike weapon. Even more impressive, not a single American aircraft was lost despite facing fierce opposition and concentrated defensive fire. Fuchi was waiting at Henderson Field when the squadron landed, arms crossed beside the operations truck, his face unreadable. As Shomo climbed out of his cockpit, the general walked over and looked down at the spent 37mm casing scattered around the plane. Each Airacobra had fired between 15 and 20 rounds. Over half their ammunition, yet nearly every hit had destroyed or crippled a vessel that would have taken multiple bombing runs to eliminate. 6 hours later, intelligence confirmed what the pilots had witnessed. The destroyed convoy had been carrying enough ammunition to supply Japanese forces on Bougainville for 3 weeks, along with vital medical supplies for isolated garrisons in the northern Solomons. Its loss crippled Japanese logistics, forcing them to depend on submarines for resupply, a slower, riskier method. The Japanese response came quickly. Within 72 hours, reconnaissance flights showed barge operations switching entirely to nighttime, with vessels sailing only in the darkest hours before dawn. Even more worrying, Japanese engineers began camouflaging their larger supply barges with nets and false foliage, making them almost invisible from the air when hidden along jungle coasts. Lieutenant Commander Tishi Nakamura, staff intelligence officer for the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet, inspected the convoy's wreckage with growing alarm. The accuracy and destructive power of the American attack showed a new kind of threat. His report to Admiral Kusaka was blunt. The enemy has developed an effective counter to our barge operations. Unless we adapt immediately, we will lose our ability to resupply forward positions. Adaptation followed fast. Japanese barge crews started mounting more anti-aircraft guns, turning their supply vessels into floating fortresses lined with 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns. Engineering units dug false channels and hidden anchorages along the coasts, giving the barges new places to vanish during American patrols. Japanese barge operations had stopped completely during daylight hours. Most importantly, Japanese fighter squadrons received new orders to maintain low-altitude air patrols specifically meant to intercept American ground attack missions. Shomo first encountered these new tactics during a dawn patrol on November 2nd. His four-plane formation was hunting barges along the New Georgia coast when Lieutenant C spotted what looked like a lone vessel anchored inside a small cove. As the Airacobras descended for their attack run, the jungle around the inlet suddenly exploded with anti-aircraft fire from hidden positions. The single barge had been bait. 6 more vessels were concealed under camouflage netting stretched between the trees, and the entire cove had been turned into a deadly trap. 20mm shells bracketed C's aircraft as he pulled out of his dive, several rounds punching through his left wing and severing hydraulic lines. Captain Wrigley's Airacobra took hits to the cooling system, forcing him to nurse his overheating engine back toward Henderson Field while trailing white vapor. What should have been a routine barge hunt turned into a running fight through intense ground fire, with the Americans managing only 1 confirmed kill out of 7 targets. Through November and December, the enemy's tactics evolved rapidly. Japanese supply crews began using decoy barges packed with flammable material that would erupt dramatically when hit, fooling attackers into believing they had destroyed ammunition vessels while the real cargo slipped away. Enemy fighters started coordinating low-altitude patrols, forcing the Americans into tight, turning battles at heights where the Airacobra's limited performance offered no advantage. On December 8th, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Shomo led his largest barge hunting mission of the war. Intelligence had reported a major Japanese supply convoy heading for Rabaul, 15 barges, carrying artillery shells and medical stores to reinforce troops preparing for the expected American invasion. The convoy was protected by 80 fighters and had chosen a route through the slot, keeping within range of coastal anti-aircraft batteries throughout the journey. The operation called for 12 Airacobras divided into 3 groups of 4. Shomo would lead the first wave against the front of the convoy. Lieutenant C would command the second against the middle vessels, and Captain Wrigley's flight would strike the rear. All 3 formations would then regroup at low altitude for the return flight. Success required perfect timing and navigation. Any delay meant the slow Airacobras would face massed fighter attacks at 0645 hours. The convoy appeared on time, but showing defenses that made Shomo's blood run cold. 15 barges sailed in a tight box formation, each one covered by overlapping arcs of anti-aircraft fire and carrying far more guns than intelligence had guessed. Above them, 80 enemy fighters flew, weaving patterns at 3,000 feet low enough to intercept diving attackers but still fast enough to keep their speed. ADV and TAGESHOM's first attack destroyed 2 barges with 4 37mm shells, but the return fire was like nothing the squadron had faced before. Tracers filled the air in continuous streams, and shells burst so close they rattled his teeth. Lieutenant Peterson's Airacobra took a direct hit to the engine, forcing him to ditch 3 miles from the convoy. He survived the landing but was captured within the hour. The second wave managed to sink 3 more barges but suffered badly. C's aircraft was hit by multiple 20 shells that destroyed his cannon and damaged his flight controls. He managed to limp back toward friendly territory but crash-landed on a small, uninhabited island 40 miles from the battle. Marine rescue teams reached him the next day, and an infection from his wounds kept him in the hospital for 6 weeks. Captain Wrigley's flight faced the most advanced countermeasures yet. As his 4 Airacobras moved in on their targets, 6 more barges suddenly appeared from concealment along the coast, ambushers with engines off and guns ready. The Americans were trapped in a deadly crossfire between the main convoy's defenses and the ambush barges. Wrigley's wingman, Lieutenant Barnes, was killed instantly when a 40 shell exploded inside his cockpit. The final count showed 7 Japanese barges destroyed or severely damaged, but the price was heavy. 3 American aircraft lost, 2 pilots killed, and 1 captured, losses too high to sustain. Worse, it was now clear that the Japanese had learned how to counter the Airacobra's tactics. The easy victories of October and early November were gone. Shomo's after-action report described an enemy growing more skilled and organized. Anti-aircraft fire was tighter and deadlier, barge crews were better trained, and the coordinated ambush showed careful planning. Most of all, Japanese fighter pilots had learned how to exploit the Airacobra's weaknesses at low altitude, forcing American pilots into fights where their aircraft's advantages meant little. Lieutenant General Kenny read the reports with deep concern. For 4 months, the P-39 squadrons had devastated Japanese logistics, destroying or damaging over 300 enemy vessels and cutting off vital supply lines through the northern Solomons. But now the enemy had adapted, turning what had once been a one-sided success into a costly war of attrition. The Pacific Air War was shifting again, and the Airacobra's brief dominance was being challenged by an opponent who refused to stop learning and evolving. The question now facing American commanders was whether the aircraft that had excelled at barge hunting could still justify its growing losses against ever smarter defenses. The answer came not from one dramatic battle, but from the final statistics of the Pacific Campaign. By March 1944, as U.S. forces prepared to assault the Marshall Islands, intelligence analysts compiled reports measuring the full impact of the barge war. The results were undeniable. In 6 months, P-39 squadrons had destroyed or damaged more than 800 Japanese supply vessels, effectively cutting off the lifeline that had sustained enemy forces across the northern Solomons and Bismarck Archipelago. On March 22, Lieutenant Colonel Shomo stood once more in General Kenny's office at Port Moresby, studying a wall chart tracking Japanese supply activity from October to February. Red pins marked successful runs. Black pins marked vessels destroyed. The pattern was obvious. Red dominated before October, but black overwhelmed the board afterward. Kenny pointed at the cluster near Rabaul. "Your squadrons didn't just sink ships, Colonel," he said. "You starved an entire theater of operations." The human cost of that success had been heavy, but manageable. The 7th Fighter Squadron, the 7th Fighter Squadron, had lost 11 aircraft and 7 pilots during the 5-month barge campaign, losses that were painful but far lower than those suffered in regular fighter missions against Japanese air defenses. More importantly, the men who survived had mastered a new kind of warfare that would prove vital as American forces advanced deeper into Japanese territory. Captain Wrigley, fully recovered and back on flight duty, developed new low-level attack techniques that were soon adopted by other P-39 units across the Pacific. Major General Fuchi's reassessment of the Airacobra program appeared in a classified memorandum dated April 5, 1944. His earlier doubts had turned into a reluctant acknowledgement of reality. The P-39 has proven effective in roles not anticipated by conventional fighter doctrine. While it remains unsuitable for high-altitude air superiority, its specialized capabilities have made a significant contribution to our logistics warfare objectives. The report recommended continued deployment of Airacobra squadrons in ground attack roles, along with upgrades to help them survive against the increasingly dangerous Japanese defenses. Japanese view of the barge war's outcome came from captured documents recovered after the liberation of Rabaul in early 1945. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura's final intelligence report, written in February 1944, revealed the strategic damage from the enemy's perspective. American fighters equipped with large-caliber cannon have effectively ended our ability to conduct surface resupply operations during daylight. Night operations continue, but they are insufficient to sustain forward positions at necessary strength. The report recommended abandoning any advanced bases that could not be supplied by submarine, effectively admitting defeat in the logistics war. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army Air Force's Historical Division confirmed the impact. Japanese forces on Bougainville, cut off from regular supply after the barge network's collapse, were forced to reduce ammunition use by 70% during the final months of the campaign. Medical supplies ran so low that field hospitals performed surgery without anesthetics, and malnutrition weakened every unit's fighting ability. The Airacobra's 37 mm cannon had achieved what traditional bombing couldn't: the systematic destruction of the enemy's ability to sustain operations. Lieutenant C.S., promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his innovations in barge hunting tactics, reflected on the campaign in a 1948 interview with Air Force historians. "We learned that the most effective weapon isn't always the fastest or the highest flying," he said. "Sometimes it's the one that hits what it aims at and destroys it with a single shot." The P-39 wasn't built for what we used it for, but it turned out perfect for the job. The aircraft's technical reputation changed in the years that followed. Engineering studies at Wright Field in 1945 revealed that the Airacobra's supposed flaws, the rear-mounted engine, the heavy cannon, and its poor high-altitude performance, were actually advantages in its new role. The cannon's recoil, which made the plane unstable in air-to-air combat, helped slow it down during attack runs on ground targets. The rear engine, which had caused balance problems at altitude, gave better weight distribution and control for precision flying close to the ground, where air density was higher. Production numbers told the rest of the story. Bell Aircraft built 9,584 P-39 Airacobras during the war, making it one of America's most numerous fighters. Early on, they were assigned to units expecting traditional dogfighting roles, leading to frustration and poor results. But as combat experience revealed the plane's unique strengths, deployment shifted. By 1944, new Airacobras were sent mainly to ground attack squadrons, where their specialized design could finally shine. The Soviet Union's use of the P-39 offered an interesting comparison. Under the Lend-Lease program, the U.S. delivered 4,746 Airacobras to Soviet forces, which used them primarily for close air support and low-altitude defense. Soviet pilots, unconcerned with Western ideas of high-altitude dogfighting, embraced the aircraft's strengths and achieved extraordinary success. Several Soviet aces, including Captain Alexander Pushkin, scored multiple victories in Airacobra's flying missions that American doctrine had once dismissed as unsuitable. Shomo's own verdict came years later. At a Pacific Veterans reunion in 1952, when asked about the Airacobra's place in aviation history, he smiled and said, The engineers who built that airplane never imagined it would spend most of the war flying 50 feet above the ocean, shooting wooden boats with a cannon made for tanks. But that's what made it work. We figured out what it could do instead of complaining about what it couldn't. The P-39's legacy outlived the war. The lessons from the barge hunting campaigns directly influenced post-war aircraft design, leading to specialized ground attack planes built for low-level precision instead of altitude or speed. The WW2 Thunderbolt II, designed in the 1970s for close air support, followed the same philosophy, a powerful cannon mounted on a stable platform, built for ground attack rather than air combat. By the end of the war, the plane once written off as a failure had built a record that spoke for itself. Beyond the 800 confirmed barge kills, Airacobra squadrons destroyed hundreds of trucks, trains, and coastal installations across the Pacific. They provided close air support for amphibious landings, flew armed reconnaissance over enemy territory, and protected friendly bases from attack. The 37mm cannon that once seemed a design mistake had become the ideal weapon for a kind of warfare no one had expected to fight. Its final vindication came in the enduring doctrine it inspired, proof that a specialized aircraft, used with imagination and precision, could achieve strategic results far beyond its original purpose.